Hello and welcome to another motorcycling video. I'm out on the country road just riding around on a Spyder, and I thought that I had probably spent enough time talking about electric vehicles for the moment. I figure that probably most of the subscribers and any of the audience who come across these videos have probably heard enough about electric vehicles, at least for the moment. I also think that I've probably talked enough about motorcycle safety. I think you've probably heard enough about that for the moment. Not to say it's not important, but I think you've probably heard more than enough about motorcycle safety for the moment. So what I thought I'd do this time is tell you a little bit about Goulburn, which is the town that I live in. So for those who live in Australia, you'll know that Australia is divided into 6 states and territories. And if you look at a map of Australia, on the east coast, or on the right-hand side of the map, you'll see there are 3 states. The one with the big pointy bit, which is Queensland. The one underneath it is New South Wales, where Goulburn is, and underneath that is Victoria. Now, New South Wales is the state with the biggest population. Its capital city is Sydney, and Goulburn is about 200 kilometres southwest of that. It is also about 100 kilometres northeast of Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, and it's located on a geographic area called the Southern Tablelands. It is about 2 hours from Goulburn directly east to the coast, to the south coast of places like Bateman's Bay. If you need to go a bit further north to say Ulladulla or Mollymook, it's maybe 2.5 hours. A bit further south than Narooma, it's about 2.5 hours. It is about 3.5 to 4 hours from the snowfields in the Snowy Mountains at the resort of Thredbo. So that's the location of Goulburn. Goulburn, the town, or the city itself, has a population of about 25,000 people, but the local government area that Goulburn is part of, which is administered by the Goulburn Mulwaree Council, has a population of about 33,000, I think, and the council's strategic plans and so on hope that by about the mid-2030s the population will be about 40,000. I'm not sure what they base those figures on, but I'm not sure where they are in regard to achieving those, or what they're doing to achieve that goal, but that's their plan. So, a little bit of history first of all. Goulburn got its name from, was given its name by James Meehan, who along with Hamilton Hume were the first known Europeans to have actually explored this area around Goulburn, the Southern Tablelands. James Meehan named it after the Secretary of State for the colonies in Britain, whose name was Henry Goulburn, or in the United Kingdom Parliament. His name was Henry Goulburn, and originally Goulburn was known as the Goulburn Plains. That was in about 1813. Now, and around a little bit later after that, Hamilton Hume and another gentleman named William Hovell were commissioned by the then governor of the colony to see if it was possible to find an overland route from Sydney to the southern capital of Victoria, Melbourne. Up until that time, all goods had to travel by sea, and so there was hope that they would find an overland route. So Hamilton Hume and William Hovell left from property in Appin, which is near Campbelltown, which is north of Goulburn, and came through this area. And the Hume Highway gets its name from the route that Hume and Hovell took, and for the most part the highway still follows that original route. They came into Victoria at a place called Corio Bay, I believe, which is near Geelong rather than near where Melbourne is currently located, but they did establish that it was possible to travel overland between Sydney and Melbourne, and eventually that became the main source of commerce and travel between the two major cities. In about the 1830s, were the first European settlements of what is now the city of Goulburn, in an area that's now called Old Goulburn. And by 1863, Goulburn had been established by letters of patent from Queen Victoria as the first inland city in Australia. So if you think of, at that time, there would have been cities in Sydney, Melbourne, Hobart, and perhaps even Launceston, I think, was established as a city by then, or established. But Goulburn was established as the first inland city, perhaps in mainland Australia anyway, by, as I say, by letters of patent from Queen Victoria. So that's a little bit of the history. Goulburn is the centre of a fine wool growing area. It's known for having some of the finest merino wool, not only in Australia but in the world. And for those who don't know really anything about Goulburn, but they're probably familiar with the big merino, which is at the southern entrance to the town. It's there for a reason, because merino wool, or merino sheep and wool growing, were a very, very important part of Goulburn's economic development. In its early days, agriculture obviously was the main reason why the town existed, to serve the pastoralists and their farming interests and so on. Over the years, that farming has sort of diversified a bit. There's beef cattle now, there is also sheep for meat rather than just sheep for wool. There are some vineyards, there's an olive grove, and there are other sort of farming activities, but agriculture is still a pretty important activity. There was a time when wool sales were conducted in Goulburn. What happened then was that people from all over the world came to Australia for a period of time, usually about 10 days. I think might have been 2 or 3 times a year. They came to Goulburn and they went to auctions where bales of wool were put up for sale to be bid upon. Fashion houses in France and Italy, for example, bought the finest wool, took it back to Milan or Paris or wherever and turned it into garments and clothing. But fine wool was a highly prized material for making clothing out of. Some decades ago, probably 3 decades ago, the wool sales were removed from Goulburn and centralised in Sydney, so those visitors didn't come anymore. Over the years, Goulburn has probably diversified its economy a lot. Like I say, agriculture is still an important part of the city's existence, but I would say probably the biggest employers now would be retail and hospitality. There is some light manufacturing and light fabricating type industries and so on, but for the most part it's retail and hospitality. Now, I can't go any further without telling you about the climate here in Goulburn, because it is pretty important. So we look at it as the 4 seasons. Summer can be generally quite mild, but there are days when the temperature does get over the 30 degrees and into the mid-30s, and nights when the temperature doesn't drop below the mid-20s. So there are some really, I guess you would say, unpleasant hot summery nights, but there are not very many of those, and generally summer is quite pleasant, although things are changing and there are more days when the temperature is up over the 35, mid-30 degree mark than there used to be 2 or 3 decades ago, for example. Spring is a beautiful season, everything's in bloom and so on, but the temperatures are always quite mild. There are very sunny days, the evenings are quite pleasant too, they're not too cool, and it's quite a pleasant season. Autumn is also a very pleasant season, lots of colour around because of changing leaves on trees and so on, but it can be quite cool. But winter is very, very cold. When I say very cold, there are many days when you get up in the morning to go to work and the temperature is in the minus bracket, and it struggles to make it into single figures of 6 or 7 or 8 degrees for the day. Sometimes with the wind chill factor it can be minus degrees for a large part of the day. I think the lowest temperature recorded here with wind chill factor was something like minus 10.3. One of the things that Goulburn is notorious for is the wind in winter. As I said earlier, we're about 3.5, 4 hours from the snowy mountains, and during winter, when those very strong winds come from the Antarctic and blow up through Victoria and across the Alps and then into New South Wales, the wind in Goulburn can be quite cold and bitter. But bearing in mind what the Scandinavians say, there is no such thing as bad weather, just the wrong clothing. So in wintertime, you know that the weather is going to be brutal, you know that it's going to be cold, you know it's going to be uncomfortable, and you need to dress accordingly. There is folklore that's part of Goulburn folklore that says that winter begins officially on Anzac Day, which is the 25th of April, and lasts until the long weekend in October. So even though the first month of spring is September, it can still be cool in September, not bitterly cold as you'd find in June, July and August, but cold nevertheless, and winter can be a long, cold season. I mentioned earlier things to do with the economy in Goulburn, and said that the main forms of main businesses are now retail and hospitality. I don't know what the unemployment rate is. It is not unusual though for people to live in Goulburn and travel to Canberra for their work. That's sometimes because people are public servants, Commonwealth public servants, and that's where their work is located. For some other people, it's just the best job that they do is in Canberra, but also there is a significant advantage in terms of house values and land values, and that you can get a house much cheaper in Goulburn than you can in Canberra. Of course, you've got to have a car and you've got to factor in the cost of fuel and registration and tyres and all those sort of things, but the difference in house prices can be something like $300,000-$400,000 depending on whereabouts in Goulburn you buy and whereabouts in Canberra you want to live as well. So it can be quite significant. I would say that probably the biggest employer in Goulburn, it would be the state government, because if you factor in the jail, the various emergency services, that is fire, ambulance, police and so on, the police academy, health and allied services and education, there are lots of people who work for the government in one form or another. All right, I think that's probably enough to talk about for the moment. I'll tell you some more things about Goulburn in the next clip. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the scenery, and I will talk to you again in the next video.